Kamsi had no choice. She was sold for $80,000. Not to slavery, not to human trafficking, but to a rich man in Korea who wanted to create sons with her dark skin. She could already feel the weight of the world press on her. She had been born into a life she didn't choose, a life where she was nothing more than a pawn in someone else's game. Her father had sold her. A debt too deep to pay, a promise too desperate to refuse. The man she was handed over to, Minwon, wasn't a typical man. He didn't care about love. He cared about legacy, his legacy. And he saw Kamsi's body as the way to shape it. For months, she was locked in his mansion, humiliated, beaten, and used. Every corner of the house echoed with the sound of his greed, a constant reminder that she wasn't even a woman to him. She was property. But that night was different. The snow outside had begun to fall, and Kamsi had felt the call of freedom deep within her soul. She had stolen a loaf of bread, hid it under the floorboards, and waited for the moment. Every night, she would go to sleep with a heart heavy with fear, but tonight, it was different. Tonight, she was going to run. With each step, her body screamed, her legs burning in the deep snow. But her heart? It raced with something new. Hope. She didn't know where she was running to, she just knew she couldn't stay. Behind her, she could hear the men shouting, the thudding of their boots in the snow, but they were nothing compared to the storm raging inside her. The world outside seemed more alive than it ever had inside that mansion. The air bit at her skin, but it was a reminder that she was still here. Still breathing. Still fighting. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she was free. But freedom wasn't as simple as running away. As Kamsi stumbled, numb and exhausted, she realized something terrifying. The snow was thick, the mountains were endless, and she was alone. But in that moment of despair, something shifted in her. She couldn't go back. Not now. Not ever. That's when she saw him. The shadow. The man who would be her captor, her savior, her storm. He stood tall, like the mountain itself, wrapped in furs and carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. A hunter. But not like any hunter she had ever imagined. This man wasn't hunting for food. He was hunting something far deeper, something buried in his soul that Kamsi couldn't understand yet. His eyes locked on hers from across the snow, and for a moment, Kamsi was frozen in place. Her breath caught in her throat, and the wildness in her heart tried to flee, but it was too late. The hunter was already closing the gap. She turned to run again, but her legs failed her, her body collapsing under the weight of exhaustion. Before she could react, his massive hand grabbed her shoulder, spinning her around. He wasn't rough. He wasn't cruel. He was something different, something scarier. His eyes, dark and fierce, didn't see her the way Minwon had. He didn't see her as property. He saw her as something else. Something he couldn't quite name. And in that moment, as she lay in the snow, his face hovering over hers, Kamsi realized the terrifying truth. She was no longer just running from the man who bought her. She was now running from the man who would make her question everything. But what happens when the person who captures you is the one who sets you free? His eyes softened, his hands shook, and in the madness of the storm, Kamsi heard his voice for the first time. You're not alone. But could she trust him? Could she ever trust anyone again? Kamsi had to make a choice. Was she going to stay, or was she going to keep running? In that moment, Kamsi had to decide. Did she run again? Or did she trust the hunter, the man who had captured her but had also shown her a sliver of humanity in the middle of the storm? There was only one way to find out. What happens next will break your heart. Will Kamsi choose to stay, or will she be swallowed by the snow and the past? Subscribe now to see what happens when two broken souls collide, and learn what it really means to choose love when your past is trying to destroy you. You won't want to miss this. Comment below. If you were Kamsi, would you trust him? Would you stay or keep running? Because what happens next will change everything. Kamsi's body ached. Every inch of her skin felt bruised, every breath a reminder of the life that had been forced on her. She lay on the cold marble floor in Minwon's bedroom, staring at the polished tiles, their cold surface biting through the thin cotton dress she wore. She didn't want to look at him. Not now. Not after the things he'd said, after the things he'd done. Minwon lay in the bed behind her, his snores muffling the sound of her thoughts. But his words still echoed in her mind. You will give me sons, beautiful sons with your dark skin. They'll carry my power. The world will see what I've created. The same words, day after day, tearing at her. Each time he spoke, it was a reminder that to him, she wasn't a woman. She was just an object, a means to an end. A breeding ground. His property. And it wasn't just the words. It was the way he looked at her, as if she was nothing but a trophy to display. But even more, it was the silence between them. The silence of being owned, of being invisible, of being nothing. She couldn't let herself think about it anymore. Her hand slipped under her thin dress, fingertips brushing the bruises that were starting to form around her collarbone, a constant reminder of his control. Kamsi clenched her fists, trying to shut out the panic that bubbled up inside her. Her eyes flickered to the floorboard where she had hidden a small piece of stolen bread. It was her only chance. The bread, saved in pieces over the last few weeks, was all she had left. It was something small, but it was hers. She'd been planning for this moment. The night was finally here. She didn't know how long she could keep up the act of submission, but she was done. She would never belong to Minwon. She would never let him break her. She stood up, the coldness of the floor still fresh on her skin, and began moving quietly toward the hallway. Every step felt like a small victory. But there was no turning back now. Minwon's men would come after her when they noticed her missing, but for now, she was free. As she stepped out of the bedroom, the weight of the mansion felt heavier than ever. The guards were drunk, playing cards in the front room, too tired to notice the young woman slipping past them in the dark. They thought she was still a puppet on Minwon's strings, but she was breaking free. She was no longer going to wait to be controlled. The blizzard outside greeted her as she stepped onto the porch. The cold hit her like a slap to the face. The world outside seemed indifferent to her pain, as if the universe itself was warning her that she didn't belong here, that she shouldn't be out here. She could hear the storm howling, but it was the only sound she needed right now. The snow was her cover, her only hope. She pulled Minwon's spare coat over her shoulders, the heavy material still smelling like him. It made her want to vomit. But it was warm, and it was her only protection against the biting cold. The world outside was nothing but white, the blizzard making it impossible to see more than 5 feet ahead of her. It was as if the snow itself was angry, like the world didn't want her to run. Her heart pounded as she took one step forward. Then another. And another. Her legs were on fire. The snow reached up to her knees, then her thighs. She had never run like this before. She had never fought this hard to stay alive. Her lungs burned with each breath. Her feet felt like they were going to freeze with every step, but she kept going. Behind her, the shouting started. Minwon's men had realized she was gone, but they wouldn't find her. The snow was too thick. The mountains were too vast. She was too small, too invisible, too easy to overlook in a country that didn't see her. The first night in the storm, she dug up frozen roots with bleeding fingers, the bitter taste of dirt mixed with the sharp sting of desperation. Her feet were numb, and she couldn't feel her toes anymore, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. If she couldn't feel the pain, she could keep moving. The mountains were beautiful, but they were cruel. They loomed above her like a constant reminder of her place in this world. The world that had never cared about her. The world that had sold her before she even had a chance to live. But it was also in the mountains that she began to feel something else. Strength. Something deep inside her, a fire that wouldn't go out. By the second day, her body was breaking down. She was cold, starving, and lost. But the more she thought about going back, the more she realized that she couldn't. The past, Minwon, her father, they couldn't control her anymore. She had to survive. She had to keep running. And then, she saw him. At first, it was just a shadow in the distance, moving through the snow like a ghost. But as he came closer, her fear grew. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in furs, and carrying a rifle on his shoulder. His eyes, even from far away, were cold, burning with an intensity she couldn't understand. She froze, her heart racing as he closed the gap between them. He didn't run after her. He walked. His strides were long, measured, as if he owned the mountains. Kamsi's legs gave out beneath her. The snow was too deep and her body too weak. She fell into the snow, unable to get up. And then, in less than a minute, he was there. His massive gloved hand grabbed her shoulder and spun her around. She landed on her back, her body aching with the impact. She looked up into his face, but it was hidden behind a dark beard, covered with snow. His eyes, they weren't looking at her. They were looking through her. Kamsi opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. He was close now, too close, and the air around them was thick with tension. She wasn't sure if he was going to kill her or save her. But in that moment, she realized one thing. She wasn't just running anymore. She had been caught. And the person who had caught her wasn't just another captor. He was something else entirely. And Kamsi had no idea what he wanted. Kamsi's body trembled as she stared up at the man who had captured her, but something in his eyes, something dark, ancient, and desperate, told her that she wasn't just another prisoner. She was about to discover that the one who captured you might be the one who can set you free. What does he want from her? Why does he look at her like that? And can she trust him, or is he just another man who will break her? Comment below. If you were Kamsi, would you trust this stranger? Or would you fight for your freedom until the end? Tell me what you think, and let's keep this conversation going. The next step in her journey is about to change everything. The snow was unrelenting. It didn't care that Kamsi was exhausted. It didn't care that her legs were burning, her feet numb, or that her body was on the verge of giving up. All it cared about was swallowing her whole, burying her under layers of icy whiteness, until she vanished, just like she never existed. But Kamsi wasn't ready to disappear. Not yet. Her breath came in sharp bursts, clouding in the air before vanishing into the storm. She tightened the coat around her shoulders, Minwon's coat, the coat that smelled of him, and pulled it tighter around her trembling frame. It was heavy, and it reeked of his control, but it was the only thing protecting her from the biting cold. She moved with purpose, each step in the snow feeling like a battle against the world. The blizzard roared around her, the winds cutting through the fabric of the coat, tearing at her skin. But Kamsi's resolve was stronger than the freezing temperatures. She had a plan now. Freedom was her goal, and nothing was going to stop her from reaching it. Behind her, the sounds of men shouting began to fade. Minwon's men, drunk, too distracted by their games to notice her escape at first, were now starting to realize she was gone. Their voices echoed in the distance, but the blizzard and the thick snow slowed them down. They weren't used to this wilderness. They didn't know how to survive in it like she did. Kamsi wasn't just running from them. She was running from everything: her father's betrayal, Minwon's ownership, the life she was sold into. But the snow, for the first time, felt like her ally. It covered her tracks, made her invisible, like she was part of the storm. Her legs screamed with every step she took. The snow reached up to her knees, then her thighs. Each movement was more difficult than the last, but Kamsi kept going. There was no other choice. The hunger gnawed at her stomach, but she had nothing but the small piece of stolen bread hidden under her coat, long gone now. Her hands were numb, her skin raw from the cold, but still, she didn't stop. The pain was nothing compared to what she'd already survived. Hours passed, and the world around her blurred into white. She couldn't see 5 feet in front of her, and the wind howled so fiercely that it felt like it was pushing against her, urging her to turn back. But she couldn't. The men were still behind her, their voices fainter now, but she knew they wouldn't stop. Minwon wouldn't let her go. She stumbled over a thick patch of snow and fell to the ground. The impact knocked the breath from her chest, and for a moment she lay there, gasping, unable to move. Her whole body ached, the cold biting into her skin like sharp needles. The snow was too deep. The cold was too much. The hunger, the exhaustion, it all threatened to swallow her up. But then, something deep inside her sparked. She couldn't let herself fall now. Not when she had made it this far. Not when freedom was so close. She had survived worse. She had to survive this. Shaking, Kamsi pushed herself to her knees and then to her feet, determined to keep moving, even when every muscle in her body screamed for rest. The pain in her legs was unbearable, but it didn't matter. She kept putting one foot in front of the other. By the time the sun had set, Kamsi was still moving, though her body felt like it was breaking apart. The snow had only deepened, and the storm hadn't slowed. Her legs were numb now, and every step she took felt like it might be her last. She didn't know how much further she could go, but there was no turning back. The thought of returning to Minwon's mansion, of returning to that life, was enough to keep her moving. She stumbled across a frozen stream, the ice thin but manageable. Her fingers were so cold now she could barely feel them, but she managed to break the ice and drink the freezing water. It burned her throat, but it was the only thing keeping her from slipping into unconsciousness. She could taste the dirt and the freezing cold in her mouth, but it was survival. With her strength slowly draining away, Kamsi pushed on, searching for shelter, for anything that could give her a moment's respite. She could hear the wind howling around her, but it felt quieter now, less like an enemy and more like a companion, wrapping itself around her to shield her from the world. But the silence of the mountains was deceiving. In the distance, faint voices carried on the wind. Minwon's men had found her trail. They were still searching. They weren't giving up. But Kamsi wasn't going to stop. She couldn't. She wouldn't. Her legs were numb, and the snow was deeper than she could have imagined. But she found a small nook in the side of the mountain, barely more than a hollow, a small space where she could crouch and catch her breath. The wind cut through her coat, but at least the snow couldn't reach her here. Exhausted, starving, cold, Kamsi huddled in the small space, clutching the stolen coat around her trembling body. She was so close to breaking. The weight of the world felt heavier now than ever before. But she had come this far, and she wasn't going to stop. Not when the storm outside felt like the only thing that understood her. Not when the wind howled as if it were whispering secrets of freedom. She wasn't alone. She couldn't afford to be alone. The storm was with her. The hours blurred together, but Kamsi held on. It was the only choice she had left. Kamsi's body was on the edge of giving up. The blizzard was consuming her, Minwon's men closing in, and yet something inside her refused to surrender. What happens next will push her beyond her limits. Will she survive the storm? Or will the world finally swallow her whole? Subscribe now because you won't want to miss the moment when Kamsi has to face the ultimate test of survival. Everything she's fought for, her freedom, her life, depends on what happens next. She's about to make a choice that will change everything. The wind howled in Kamsi's ears, biting at her skin like the sharpest knife. Her body, already pushed to its limits, felt like it was going to give out at any moment. Every breath was a struggle, her chest heaving as she staggered through the snow-covered wilderness, her legs stiff and numb. She had no idea how much longer she could keep going, but her will to survive, her need to escape, was the only thing keeping her moving. The storm had yet to ease. The snow continued to fall relentlessly, wrapping the world in a white, suffocating blanket. She couldn't feel her toes anymore, and her fingers were barely functional. The stolen coat she wore, heavy and damp, offered little protection. Still, Kamsi kept pushing forward, each step harder than the last. Her mind was numb, her thoughts scattered. But then she saw him. A shadow. At first, it was a blur, just a dark figure moving through the thick snowstorm. She couldn't make out the details, but the figure was tall, broad-shouldered, and moving with purpose. Something primal and familiar stirred deep inside Kamsi. She froze. Her breath hitched in her throat as fear surged through her. It wasn't the snowstorm that made her heart race, it was the man who was closing in on her. A hunter. Kamsi's instincts screamed at her to run, to hide, but her body was too exhausted. Her legs were shaking, barely able to keep her upright. Panic washed over her like a wave, but she couldn't move. Not yet. She was trapped again. The man was dressed in animal furs, a rifle slung across his shoulder. His face was hidden beneath layers of snow and shadows, but his presence was overwhelming. The way he moved through the snow, his steps long and deliberate, told her everything she needed to know. He was no stranger to the mountains. He wasn't just surviving. He was dominating. He was the hunter, and she was the prey. The tension between them crackled in the air. Kamsi could feel his eyes on her, even though they hadn't yet met. She had no idea who he was, but there was something in his posture, the way he carried himself, that told her he wasn't here to help. He wasn't here to save her. He was just another man, like all the others. He was her captor, whether he knew it or not. Her mind raced as she searched for a way out, but there was nothing. No trees to climb, no rocks to hide behind. The snow, the mountains, they were all against her. She was exposed, and he was coming closer. Then, as if sensing her thoughts, he stopped. His eyes locked on hers from across the clearing. The world seemed to go still. For a moment, Kamsi thought she might pass out from the sheer terror that gripped her chest. She couldn't move. Her body was frozen, like a deer in headlights. He didn't rush toward her. Instead, he stood still, watching her as the snow continued to swirl around them. The cold seemed to seep deeper into her bones as she waited for him to make his move. She couldn't read his face. His eyes were hard, his expression unreadable, but there was something in the way he looked at her that felt different from the way Minwon or his men had looked at her. There was no lust in his gaze, no control. Just an intensity that made her feel small, insignificant, and yet, strangely, something else, something she couldn't quite name. As he moved toward her, his steps slow but measured, Kamsi's heart pounded in her chest. She knew she should run, should fight, but her body felt like it was made of lead. Every step she took felt like it could be her last. And then he spoke. "Are you lost?" His voice was deep, rough, like it had been carved from the same hard mountain stone he seemed to be made of. His words weren't harsh, but there was a weight to them, a kind of heaviness that felt like a command, even though he wasn't ordering her to do anything. Kamsi didn't answer. She couldn't. The storm around them seemed to swallow her words before they even left her mouth. She was too scared to speak, too terrified to move. The man, Kale, as he would later introduce himself, came closer, his eyes never leaving hers. He studied her the way one would study a wild animal they didn't yet understand. "Do you need help?" Kale asked again, his voice softer this time. His eyes flickered over her, taking in the state of her torn clothes, the bruises on her neck, the exhaustion written all over her face. For a moment, Kamsi couldn't breathe. She couldn't decide if she should trust him, if she should speak, or if she should just keep running until the snow swallowed her whole. Kale's gaze softened for just a moment, a flicker of something in his eyes, something like pity. But then it was gone, replaced by the same stoic indifference she had grown used to from men who had no use for her except as a tool, a commodity. "Don't be afraid," he said, taking another step closer. Kamsi's heart pounded louder, her pulse racing, but her legs refused to move. She was stuck, completely paralyzed by fear. But then, something unexpected happened. Kale reached into his coat and pulled out a small packet of dried meat, his movement slow, deliberate. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'm just trying to survive, just like you." Kamsi's eyes locked on the food, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she realized how hungry she was. The hunger gnawed at her insides, sharp and relentless, but there was no way she could trust him. She couldn't. She had been fooled too many times before. Still, she was starving. Her throat ached as she swallowed, her gaze flickering between the food and the rifle resting on Kale's shoulder. Was this a trick? Was this how it started? Was he going to trap her in his own way, just like Minwon had? "Take it," Kale said, his voice soft but firm. "You don't have to trust me. But you need it. We both do." Kamsi's body trembled, torn between the need for survival and the fear of being captured again. But then something shifted in her chest, something deep. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was the exhaustion that was finally starting to break her down. But whatever it was enough to make her step forward, slowly, cautiously, and take the packet from his hands. What is Kale's true intention? Is he truly offering help, or is he just another man with a hidden agenda? Kamsi has already escaped one prison. Can she trust this rugged stranger, or is she walking into yet another trap? The wind howled in Kamsi's ears, biting at her skin like the sharpest knife. Her body, already pushed to its limits, felt like it was going to give out at any moment. Every breath was a struggle, her chest heaving as she staggered through the snow-covered wilderness, her legs stiff and numb. She had no idea how much longer she could keep going, but her will to survive, her need to escape, was the only thing keeping her moving. The storm had yet to ease. The snow continued to fall relentlessly, wrapping the world in a white, suffocating blanket. She couldn't feel her toes anymore, and her fingers were barely functional. The stolen coat she wore, heavy and damp, offered little protection. Still, Kamsi kept pushing forward, each step harder than the last. Her mind was numb, her thoughts scattered. But then she saw him. A shadow. At first, it was a blur, just a dark figure moving through the thick snowstorm. She couldn't make out the details, but the figure was tall, broad-shouldered, and moving with purpose. Something primal and familiar stirred deep inside Kamsi. She froze. Her breath hitched in her throat as fear surged through her. It wasn't the snowstorm that made her heart race, it was the man who was closing in on her. A hunter. Kamsi's instincts screamed at her to run, to hide, but her body was too exhausted. Her legs were shaking, barely able to keep her upright. Panic washed over her like a wave, but she couldn't move. Not yet. She was trapped again. The man was dressed in animal furs, a rifle slung across his shoulder. His face was hidden beneath layers of snow and shadows, but his presence was overwhelming. The way he moved through the snow, his steps long and deliberate, told her everything she needed to know. He was no stranger to the mountains. He wasn't just surviving. He was dominating. He was the hunter, and she was the prey. The tension between them crackled in the air. Kamsi could feel his eyes on her, even though they hadn't yet met. She had no idea who he was, but there was something in his posture, the way he carried himself, that told her he wasn't here to help. He wasn't here to save her. He was just another man, like all the others. He was her captor, whether he knew it or not. Her mind raced as she searched for a way out, but there was nothing. No trees to climb, no rocks to hide behind. The snow, the mountains, they were all against her. She was exposed, and he was coming closer. Then, as if sensing her thoughts, he stopped. His eyes locked on hers from across the clearing. The world seemed to go still. For a moment, Kamsi thought she might pass out from the sheer terror that gripped her chest. She couldn't move. Her body was frozen, like a deer in headlights. He didn't rush toward her. Instead, he stood still, watching her as the snow continued to swirl around them. The cold seemed to seep deeper into her bones as she waited for him to make his move. She couldn't read his face. His eyes were hard, his expression unreadable, but there was something in the way he looked at her that felt different from the way Minwon or his men had looked at her. There was no lust in his gaze, no control. Just an intensity that made her feel small, insignificant, and yet, strangely, something else, something she couldn't quite name. As he moved toward her, his steps slow but measured, Kamsi's heart pounded in her chest. She knew she should run, should fight, but her body felt like it was made of lead. Every step she took felt like it could be her last. And then he spoke. "Are you lost?" His voice was deep, rough, like it had been carved from the same hard mountain stone he seemed to be made of. His words weren't harsh, but there was a weight to them, a kind of heaviness that felt like a command, even though he wasn't ordering her to do anything. Kamsi didn't answer. She couldn't. The storm around them seemed to swallow her words before they even left her mouth. She was too scared to speak, too terrified to move. The man, Kale, as he would later introduce himself, came closer, his eyes never leaving hers. He studied her the way one would study a wild animal they didn't yet understand. "Do you need help?" Kale asked again, his voice softer this time. His eyes flickered over her, taking in the state of her torn clothes, the bruises on her neck, the exhaustion written all over her face. For a moment, Kamsi couldn't breathe. She couldn't decide if she should trust him, if she should speak, or if she should just keep running until the snow swallowed her whole. Kale's gaze softened for just a moment, a flicker of something in his eyes, something like pity. But then it was gone, replaced by the same stoic indifference she had grown used to from men who had no use for her except as a tool, a commodity. "Don't be afraid," he said, taking another step closer. Kamsi's heart pounded louder, her pulse racing, but her legs refused to move. She was stuck, completely paralyzed by fear. But then, something unexpected happened. Kale reached into his coat and pulled out a small packet of dried meat, his movements slow, deliberate. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'm just trying to survive, just like you." Kamsi's eyes locked on the food, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she realized how hungry she was. The hunger gnawed at her insides, sharp and relentless, but there was no way she could trust him. She couldn't. She had been fooled too many times before. Still, she was starving. Her throat ached as she swallowed, her gaze flickering between the food and the rifle resting on Kale's shoulder. Was this a trick? Was this how it started? Was he going to trap her in his own way, just like Minon had? "Take it," Kale said, his voice soft but firm. "You don't have to trust me. But you need it. We both do." Kamsi's body trembled, torn between the need for survival and the fear of being captured again. But then something shifted in her chest, something deep. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was the exhaustion that was finally starting to break her down. But whatever it was enough to make her step forward, slowly, cautiously, and take the packet from his hands. What is Kale's true intention? Is he truly offering help, or is he just another man with a hidden agenda? Kamsi has already escaped one prison. Can she trust this rugged stranger, or is she walking into yet another trap? Kamsi's heart raced as her legs gave way beneath her, and she collapsed into the snow, her body crumpling like a broken doll. The cold seeped through her clothes, but it wasn't the snow that made her freeze, it was the man standing over her. Kale. His towering figure blocked out the blizzard, casting a shadow over her fragile form. She tried to scramble, tried to push herself up from the snow, but her body refused to cooperate. The exhaustion, the hunger, the terror. They all crushed her, pinning her to the ground as if she were nothing more than an animal caught in a trap. In a flash, Kale was there, his rough, calloused hand grabbing her shoulder and pulling her back to the ground. Kamsi gasped, her breath shallow, a mix of fear and desperation flooding her chest. She couldn't escape. She couldn't move. Kale's dark eyes were fixed on her, not in the way Minwon's had been, full of control, ownership, desire, but with something different. Something deeper. His gaze was intense, almost painful, as if he were searching for something in her. He wasn't looking at her as a woman to claim. He was looking at her like she was something to be saved, something to fix. For a brief moment, she felt his touch on her cheek. It was rough, like everything else about him, but there was no cruelty in it. It wasn't an act of possession. It was something else. Something desperate. Kamsi shuddered, her mind racing with confusion. What did he want from her? What did he see in her? She tried to push his hand away, but her arms were weak, her body drained. She had no fight left in her, no strength to resist. His fingers lingered on her skin, his gaze steady, as if he were studying her like an object, something foreign, something to understand. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking, but she didn't even know if he heard her. Kale said nothing. He just watched her with a kind of quiet intensity, his face hard but not unkind. His eyes held a story. One of pain, of loss, of years spent alone in this frozen world. Kamsi could feel the weight of it, feel it pressing down on her as if it were suffocating them both. She wanted to scream, to fight him off, but she was so weak, so vulnerable. "I'm not like them," Kale finally spoke, his voice low, rough with emotion. "I'm not here to hurt you. I'm not here to own you." But his words felt hollow. Not here to own me? What did that even mean? She had heard so many lies in her life. Too many broken promises to count. What if this was just another game? Another man who wanted to use her, to control her, to fix her like some broken thing? But the desperation in his voice, the sorrow hidden in those dark eyes, it made her hesitate. For the first time, she wasn't sure if he was just another predator or something else entirely. You're not a prisoner here, Kale continued, though his voice was unsteady. I'm not like them. I know what it's like to be trapped, to be broken. But I can't let you go just yet. I need to know that you understand. Kamsi's heart raced. Understand what? She croaked, her throat dry. Kale's eyes flickered for a second, a mix of regret and pain crossing his face. That you're not alone in this. He exhaled sharply, as if the words were too much to carry. That there's a way out. I can't let you keep running. Kamsi blinked, her mind spinning. A way out? Was that even possible? Was she supposed to trust this man? She barely knew him, and yet his words seemed to resonate with something deep inside her, something she couldn't ignore. Kale slowly pulled his hand away from her cheek, but his gaze lingered. The storm raged around them, but in that moment, it felt like the rest of the world had faded away. There was just him, just her, and a tension in the air that neither of them could escape. Kamsi's mind was a storm of its own questions, doubts, fear swirling around her like the blizzard outside. She was exhausted, starving, and cold, but more than that, she was terrified. Terrified of him, terrified of herself, terrified of trusting someone who could betray her just like everyone else. But there was something else in his eyes. A vulnerability. A rawness. She saw it, and for a moment, she wondered if he was as broken as she was. Please, she whispered again, her voice shaking. I don't want to be trapped anymore. Kale's face softened, his jaw tightening as if he was struggling to hold something back. He reached out slowly, his hand hovering above her, unsure whether to touch her again. I know you don't, he said quietly. But right now, I'm the only thing keeping you from falling apart completely. I'm not going to hurt you, Kamsi. But I need you to trust me. Trust him? How could she trust him when her whole life had been built on lies and betrayal? When she had been sold like property? How could she trust anyone ever again? But the pain in his eyes, it felt so real. And for the first time since she ran, Kamsi allowed herself to think, maybe, just maybe, she wasn't completely alone. Kamsi's trust is being tested in the harshest of ways. She's faced with the impossible decision of whether to believe a man who could either be her savior or another betrayer. Does she trust Kale, the man who says he'll help her, or does she continue to run alone, afraid, and lost in the storm? Subscribe now to see what happens next. Will Kamsi put her faith in Kale, or will the weight of her past push her away from the one man who could offer her a chance at redemption? The tension between them is thick, and one choice will change everything. Comment below. What would you do in Kamsi's shoes? Would you trust Kale or keep running? This choice could either save her or destroy her. Stay tuned because what happens next will force you to question everything you know about trust, survival, and love. Days passed in a quiet, suffocating rhythm. The storm outside had subsided, leaving behind only the bitter cold and the silence that stretched between Kamsi and Kale. They didn't speak much, but it wasn't uncomfortable, not at first. Kale had taken it upon himself to care for her, providing her with food, the warmth of his fire, and the safety of his cabin. He did it without question, without expectation, but there was something in his eyes, something that Kamsi couldn't quite place. His presence was constant, like the mountains themselves, steady, unyielding. But still, the silence hung heavy in the air. He never forced conversation. He never asked about her past. He didn't need to. He knew there were things Kamsi wasn't ready to share, just like there were things he kept buried inside him. At night, when the fire had burned low and the cabin was filled with nothing but the crackling of logs and the howling wind outside, Kale would sit beside her. Not for intimacy. Not for comfort in the way she'd expected from others. He didn't touch her in any way that made her feel like a possession. No. He simply sat there, across from her, as though he was waiting for her to speak, to reach out. In those moments, Kamsi's heart would race, her mind torn between the desire to break the silence and the fear of revealing too much. She wasn't used to being listened to. She wasn't used to anyone caring enough to sit in silence with her, waiting for her to find the words. The night she finally spoke, it wasn't a grand decision. It wasn't an epiphany or some planned moment of vulnerability. It happened because her mind had been carrying the weight of her past for so long that it began to spill out like a flood. "I don't want to be a womb," Kamsi said suddenly, breaking the silence between them. Her voice was soft, fragile, almost unrecognizable. It was the first time in days she had said more than a few words to him. Kale didn't look surprised. He simply turned his head toward her, his dark eyes meeting hers. The flickering firelight danced across his face, casting shadows on his strong features, but there was a softness there, something she hadn't seen before. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice low, gentle. He wasn't pushing. He wasn't prying. He was simply giving her space to speak, space she hadn't realized she needed until now. Kamsi swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't meant to say it out loud, but now that the words were out, she couldn't take them back. The truth was spilling unrestrained. "My father," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "He sold me. He sold me to Minwon. I was nothing to them. A body. A vessel. A means to an end." She paused, her hands clenched in her lap. She was shaking, but it wasn't just from the cold anymore. "I was so terrified. So lost. All I wanted was to matter to someone. To be seen. To be more than just a womb, a way to make some rich man's legacy. But they didn't care. No one cared. I didn't matter to anyone but them. I was nothing." Kale remained silent, watching her carefully. His eyes were dark, his expression unreadable, but Kamsi could see the subtle tension in his jaw, the way his shoulders were pulled tight. He was listening. Really listening. And for the first time, it felt like someone saw her. Not as property. Not as a tool to be used. But as a person. "I don't want to be nothing anymore," Kamsi whispered, her voice breaking. She wiped at her eyes, ashamed of the tears that had started to fall, but she couldn't stop them. "I'm so afraid I'll become that. I'll just fade away. Like a ghost." Kale's gaze softened, and for the first time, he reached out. Not to touch her, no, it wasn't like that. Instead, he simply placed a hand on the table between them, his fingers lightly resting on the surface. "I know what it's like to be broken," he said quietly. "To feel like you've lost everything. Like you're drowning in a storm, and no one even knows you're out there. But you're still here, Kamsi. You're still fighting. That means something." Kamsi shook her head. "I don't feel like I'm fighting anymore. I'm just surviving. I don't know how to be anything else." Kale's eyes darkened, and for a brief moment, Kamsi saw a flicker of pain there. His hand twitched, but he didn't reach for her. Instead, he pulled it back slowly, as though he was fighting something inside himself. "You're not alone anymore," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't make you forget what you've been through. I can't undo the pain. But I can be here. And that counts for something." Kamsi stared at him, her heart in her throat. She wasn't used to hearing words like that. They felt like something she couldn't trust, something too good to be true. But for some reason, she wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was something better waiting for her. Kale was a man of few words, but in that moment, his silence spoke louder than anything. He wasn't offering her a life of comfort, not yet. But he was offering her something she hadn't had in a long time, hope. Her breath hitched as she looked at him, and without thinking, she whispered, "Why are you doing this?" Kale's eyes softened, and for a moment, there was a vulnerability there that caught Kamsi off guard. "I don't know," he admitted quietly. "I don't know why I'm helping you. Maybe I see myself in you. Or maybe I'm just tired of being alone." Kamsi's heart skipped a beat. He was more than just a stranger to her now. He was someone who had endured loss, just like her. Someone who, in his own way, understood what it meant to be broken. And in that quiet, fragile moment, she knew that her journey, her fight to survive, wasn't over yet. But maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she had thought. Kamsi's heart is torn between the fragile connection she feels with Kale and the fear that it's all just another lie. She's learning to trust again, but can she truly let go of the past and embrace the future? Subscribe now to see what happens when Kamsi faces the hardest choice of her life. Will she open her heart to Kale and begin the healing process? Or will the shadows of her past keep her from the peace she so desperately needs? Comment below. Do you think Kamsi should trust Kale, or is she setting herself up for more heartbreak? Let me know your thoughts. This decision could change everything. Stay tuned, because Kamsi's journey is far from over. The hardest part is yet to come. Kamsi had barely begun to understand the freedom she'd fought so hard to claim when the ground beneath her seemed to shake, the silence shattered by the sound of men's voices. The peace she had found in Kale's cabin, the warmth, the safety of a home she never thought she'd have, was suddenly ripped away. It started as a low hum, barely perceptible above the wind. Then it grew louder until Kamsi could hear the unmistakable sound of boots crunching in the snow. Her heart froze in her chest. Minwon. Her pulse quickened as the realization hit. It was him. The man who had purchased her. The man who had broken her. He had found her. Kale, who had been working in the back of the cabin, instantly tensed. He was already halfway to the door before Kamsi could speak, but her voice stopped him. "No," she said, barely a whisper. Her legs felt weak, as though the very thought of facing him again could knock her down. Kale looked back at her, his face hardening. "Stay here," he ordered. But she could see it in his eyes. He wasn't just telling her to stay hidden. He was telling her to stay safe. But it wasn't safety she wanted. She was done hiding. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Kale's eyes flickered with hesitation, but he didn't argue. Instead, he stood still for a moment, gathering his thoughts, before heading toward the door. He reached for his rifle, checking it one last time, then turned to face Kamsi, a fierce determination in his eyes. "If it comes down to it," Kale said quietly, his voice low, "I won't let him take you." Kamsi's chest tightened. She knew what he meant. It was the same promise he had made to himself the day he found her in the storm, the promise to protect her, no matter the cost. But this time, it wasn't just about survival. It was about a reckoning. Outside, the wind howled, but the stillness that followed was worse. Kamsi could hear the voices of Minwon's men getting closer. Then, in the distance, a familiar voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Kamsi," Minwon called, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. "You don't belong here. Come back with me." Kamsi flinched at the sound of his voice, but Kale's presence was a steadying force beside her. She felt him before she saw him. His solid frame against the doorway, the weight of his past pressing down on him as he stood ready to face what was coming. "Tell him to leave," Kamsi said, though she already knew what the answer would be. Kale didn't answer at first. He was too focused on the men outside, the ones who had come to take Kamsi back, to drag her back into the life she had fought so hard to escape. His hands were steady as he held his rifle, his eyes never leaving the doorway. "I'm not asking for your permission, Kamsi," Kale said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I will protect you." She nodded, understanding the weight of his words. There would be no turning back now. Kale stepped out into the snow, his presence as unyielding as the mountains surrounding them. Kamsi watched from the cabin, her heart racing in her chest as she saw Minwon's silhouette in the distance, his men flanking him. They were closing in, and Kamsi knew that the past she had been running from was finally catching up to her. Minwon didn't waste any time. "This is over, Kamsi," he said, his tone harsh and unyielding. "You belong to me. You always have." Kale stepped forward, his rifle raised, but his eyes never left Kamsi. He wasn't afraid. He had already faced his demons. "You're not taking her," he said, his voice a promise. The tension between them thickened. Kamsi could feel the weight of it in the air, a storm of emotions about to break. She had never imagined this moment, the choice that was now hers. Go back to the man who had controlled her life, or stay with Kale, the man who had shown her kindness, who had given her a chance at freedom. Kale's eyes met hers across the distance. She saw the rawness in his gaze, the pain he was willing to face to protect her. She saw something in him that mirrored the fear inside her. He wasn't just protecting her, he was protecting himself, too. He needed this. "Please," Kamsi Minwon called, his voice now laced with desperation. "I'm giving you one last chance. Come back with me, and I'll make everything right. I'll make sure you never have to suffer again." The word stung, but Kamsi wasn't that woman anymore. She wasn't the woman who would go back to be controlled. She wasn't the woman who would let fear dictate her life. "No," she said, her voice steady, even though every part of her wanted to break. Minhwan's eyes flared with anger, but before he could speak again, Kale raised his rifle, steady and unshaken. "Stay where you are," Kale warned. "This ends now." The confrontation was inevitable. But Kamsi didn't look away. She couldn't. The choice was clear now. She could go back to the life Minhwan had planned for her, a life of submission, of fear. Or she could stand with Kale, the man who had fought for her when no one else had. As Kale's men made their move, Kamsi's heart beat loudly in her chest. She wasn't the woman who would ever let herself be bought or sold again. Not after everything she had been through. And when the first gunshot rang out, it wasn't just a battle for survival, it was a battle for redemption. The sound of fighting filled the air, but Kamsi stood frozen in place. There was no more running. She was facing the past she had tried to forget, and the man who had held her hostage for too long. And this time, she would fight. The road ahead was unclear, and with each step, Kamsi felt the weight of her past press in on her. But as she walked beside Kale, her heart began to feel lighter, heavier in some ways, too, but lighter in the most unexpected of ways. The mountains, the storm, Minhwan, they were all behind her now. But she knew the ghosts of her past would follow. They always did. But now, for the first time in so long, she had a choice. She could run again, hide from what had happened to her, or she could face it head-on, with Kale by her side. Kale walked beside her, his steps steady, his face shadowed with his own thoughts. They didn't speak much, but the silence wasn't as heavy as it once was. They had found a rhythm, a quiet understanding between them. His presence was a comfort now, not a reminder of the danger that had once hovered over her. Her hand brushed his, just once, a small spark between them. She felt it deep in her chest, that pull, that connection that had been there since the first moment they had met in the snow. He had saved her then, but she was starting to believe that he might need saving too. "Do you ever think about going back?" she asked quietly, looking up at the snow-capped peaks in the distance, a reminder of how far they had come. Kale didn't answer right away. He slowed his pace, glancing at her with a look that was hard to read. "Sometimes," he said after a pause, his voice low. "But I've learned that some things are better left behind. The past, it can't define you if you don't let it." Kamsi nodded. She knew exactly what he meant. She had spent so long running from her past, afraid it would swallow her whole. But here, with Kale, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she could move forward, even if the road was uncertain. Even if the pain was still there, buried deep inside her. The wind picked up again, colder than before, and Kamsi instinctively pulled her coat tighter around herself. Kale noticed and instinctively moved closer, his shoulder brushing against hers in a gesture that was protective, familiar. It was in moments like this, the quiet between the chaos, that Kamsi started to see the man Kale really was. He was more than the rugged hunter. He was someone who had seen the worst of the world and still chose to stand beside her. She wasn't sure when it happened, when the fear inside her began to melt away, but by the time the sun dipped low, she realized something. She had begun to trust him, not just as someone who had saved her, but as someone she could build something with. "We're not the same people we were when we started this journey," Kale said after a long pause, his voice thoughtful. "And that's not a bad thing. We've survived things that would break most people. But we're still here." Kamsi felt a lump form in her throat. She had survived. She had made it out of the storm, out of the darkness, but it wasn't just about surviving anymore. She wanted to live. She wanted to make something new, something that wasn't defined by pain or fear. And for the first time in a long time, she believed it was possible. "I know," she whispered. "I've been broken too. But I'm learning to piece myself together again. Slowly. And I think we're both learning how to live instead of just survive." Kale stopped walking and turned to her, his eyes intense. The depth of his gaze held something: vulnerability, yes, but also hope. It was as though he, too, was finally starting to believe in the possibility of something more. "You're not broken," he said, his voice rough, but sincere. "I see you. You're stronger than you think. And I won't let you go through this alone." "Not anymore." Kamsi's breath caught in her throat. The sincerity in his words was like a balm to her battered soul. She had been afraid to believe that love, that real, raw, messy love, could exist after everything she had been through. But there it was, in his eyes, in his words. She wasn't sure when it had happened, when the connection between them had shifted, but she knew now that what they had wasn't just survival. It was something deeper. Something worth fighting for. "I'm not going anywhere either," she said softly, a smile tugging at her lips. This is real. This is what I've been fighting for." They stood there for a moment, the wind howling around them, but they didn't feel cold anymore. Kamsi felt warmth spreading through her chest, something that had been buried for so long, and she realized this was the freedom she had been running toward. Not just from Min on, not just from her past, but from the fear that had kept her trapped in darkness for so long. Kale's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining, and Kamsi knew that no matter what happened next, they would face it together. She wasn't alone anymore. As they walked toward the setting sun, the light spilling across the snow, Kamsi couldn't help but feel that something had shifted between them. This wasn't just a fleeting connection, something born of necessity or survival. This was real. This was the beginning of something beautiful. But even in the safety of their newfound peace, Kamsi knew the past had a way of coming back, of trying to claw its way into the present. There was still a long road ahead, filled with dangers and shadows she couldn't anticipate. But whatever came next, she knew one thing for sure: she was no longer running. She was living. Kamsi and Kale have found something rare, a connection that transcends survival, a love born of fire. But will it be enough to face the darkness that still looms over them? The past has a way of returning when you least expect it, and Kamsi's journey is far from over. Subscribe now to see what happens when love and survival collide. Will Kamsi and Kale's fragile peace be shattered, or will they finally find the freedom they've been searching for? Comment below. Do you think Kamsi and Kale's love can survive the challenges ahead, or will their pasts tear them apart? Let me know what you think, and stay with us for the ride of a lifetime. The road to freedom is just beginning, and the biggest challenges are still ahead. You won't want to miss what happens next. The air was different here. Not just the cool breeze that swept across the hills or the rustle of the trees that stood tall like sentinels around them. No, it was the feeling that hung in the space between Kamsi and Kale. It was the quiet peace they had earned through every hardship, every tear, every moment of fear and doubt that had once seemed endless. They had left the shadows behind, but more importantly, they had learned not to let them define who they were becoming. In this small piece of the world they had carved out together, love no longer felt like a burden or a chain. It felt like freedom. They had built something from the ground up, something real. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was theirs. Their home was small, nestled at the edge of a quiet village where people didn't look at them like strangers. They were just Kamsi and Kale, two people who had survived, who had loved, who had fought to be free. And for the first time, they could breathe without fear, without the weight of their past bearing down on them. Kamsi stood by the small window, looking out over the field that stretched before her, watching Kale as he worked the land. There was a contentment in his movements now, something she hadn't seen before. He was no longer the man hiding from his grief, and she wasn't the woman who had run from her pain. Together, they had found a way to live, really live. Despite everything they had endured, she could hear him whistling softly as he worked, and for the first time, she let herself smile. It was a genuine smile, not one forced out of necessity or habit. It was the kind of smile that said she had found peace. But there was something else she had found in this place, something even more precious than the freedom she had fought for. It was the love they had built together. The love that had transformed them both. Kale came inside, his face flushed from the work, his hands rough but gentle as he placed a warm bowl of soup on the table in front of her. "It's not much, but it'll keep you warm," he said, his voice low, his eyes still holding that tenderness that had become so familiar. Kamsi reached out, taking the bowl, but she didn't eat right away. Instead, she looked at him, really looked at him, the man who had been her protector, her anchor, and now her partner. He had saved her in more ways than she could count. But more than that, he had allowed her to save herself. He had never asked her to be someone else, never asked her to be anyone's idea of perfect. He had just asked her to be her. "You've given me more than I ever thought I could have," Kamsi said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "You've shown me what it means to live, to love, to choose. You've given me something I didn't think was possible." Kale's expression softened, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence between them, comfortable, peaceful. Then he sat beside her, his hand reaching out to touch hers. "I think we've given each other that, Kamsi," he said, his voice low but steady. "It wasn't easy. It wasn't quick. But here we are." Kamsi nodded, her heart swelling in her chest. The weight that had once settled so heavily on her, the chains of her past that had threatened to break her, now felt distant, like a bad dream she had finally woken up from. They were both still healing, still moving forward. But the pain wasn't all that remained. There was more now. There was love, and there was hope. And there was something else, something even deeper, a new life. She placed her hand on her belly, her fingers brushing the curve that had begun to show. Kale's eyes followed the motion, his face lighting up with the same sense of awe and wonder that filled her heart. "A new beginning," he whispered, his voice filled with wonder. Kamsi smiled, tears welling up in her eyes. Yes, a new beginning. Their child. The final piece of their healing. The symbol of their new life together. It was hard to believe sometimes that this was the same woman who had run through the snow, terrified and alone. The same man who had carried his grief like a weight too heavy to bear. But here they were, in this small, humble home they had built together. It wasn't just a place. It was a future. It was a chance to leave behind the ghosts that had haunted them for so long. The sound of a baby's cry, though still a dream in the distance, filled Kamsi's heart with something she couldn't put into words. There was life, real and new, growing between them. The cycles of pain and violence they had been born into would not define their child. They had broken that cycle, and together, they would raise a child who knew nothing but love. As the evening set in, the light from the fire flickered softly across the room. Kamsi and Kale sat together in the quiet, their fingers intertwined. They weren't alone anymore. They weren't broken anymore. They were whole, and for the first time, Kamsi felt a peace so deep, so unshakable, that she couldn't help but believe it was real. This was her legacy. Their legacy. A legacy of love. Kamsi and Kale's journey is far from over, and the hardest part is yet to come. Stay with us to find out what happens next. Kamsi had often wondered what it would feel like to be free. Not just physically, but truly free. Unshackled from the weight of her past, from the chains of a life that never let her breathe, never let her dream. She had spent so long running, hiding, surviving. But now, sitting in the warmth of their home, her hand resting on her swollen belly, she understood what it meant to finally be free. Kale had been her saving grace, but in the quiet moments of reflection, Kamsi realized something more profound. He hadn't just saved her, he had given her the chance to save herself. He had shown her that love, true love, didn't come with conditions. It didn't come with expectations or demands. It came with acceptance. It came with understanding. It came with the kind of freedom she had never thought possible. They had both walked through their own personal hells, each carrying scars that ran deeper than the skin. But together, they had built something beautiful from the ashes of their pain. Together, they had found a way to live, a way to love. As the seasons changed, So did they. The past that had once defined them, the shadows that had haunted them, no longer had a hold on their lives. Kamsi and Kale didn't run from their history. They embraced it, learned from it, and built something new. They were no longer just survivors. They were builders. Builders of a future, a family, and a love so strong it would withstand anything. When their child was born, Kamsi held her baby in her arms with a sense of wonder and awe. This little life was the promise of a new world, a world where love was the foundation and fear had no place. The cycles of pain and betrayal that had once defined her life were now broken. The legacy she would pass on to her child was one of strength, of choice, and of love. And as Kale stood beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, Kamsi knew that they had done it. They had built a life worth living. They had broken free. Not just from the chains of the past, but from the belief that their lives would always be marked by suffering. This was their story. A story of survival, of healing, and ultimately, of redemption. A story that proved that no matter how broken you feel, no matter how far you've fallen, you can always rise again. And sometimes, it's love that helps you find the strength to do it. Kamsi had found her freedom. Kale had found his peace. And together, they had found a love that would endure for the rest of their lives. Their legacy, built on the foundation of their shared pain and unshakable love, would be one that their child would carry forward. And in that, they found not just their redemption, but their reason to believe in the future. The storm had passed. The darkness was gone. And in its place stood the light of a new beginning, one that would shine brightly, not just for them, but for the generations that would follow. And in that light, they would always be free.